Good morning. My name is Charity, and there is no way that I am related to Albert Einstein, considering his IQ. But anyway, I am here today to read the Bible story on behalf of Robin. Our reading today is from the book of Genesis, chapter 16, verses 1 to 15. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to the husband, Abram, as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to shore. And he said, "Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with all his kin." So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi," for she said, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him?" Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael.
Hello everyone, I'm Joel, but I will be reading from the script as if I am Evangeline, which is going to make some things a bit strange. And also, I am not an expert on anything really, but especially not the things in here. So if I get something wrong, that's on me, and if it's good, that's on Evangeline. Hello everyone, my name is Evangeline. And I'm super hyped to bring you another niche story from the Old Testament that I have managed to shoehorn into our current sermon series. This week's theme is "Blessed are those who feel alone." I think we can all relate to that to some extent. In my sample poll, which involves turning to my husband, me, who was mustering up the resolve to go to work and asking him, "In what way do you feel alone?" It looks like the average person feels like, and I quote, "No one will ever understand me. I don't want to go to work. Blah. I think I'm going to die of sadness." I felt rather miffed by this response. Like, no one will ever understand me. My loneliness feels like I'm standing on a cliff, with 1,000 eyes chipped into the bedrock, forcibly dressed in a red pinafore that I can't get off. What, you can't relate? Maybe you can relate to this one. Dr. Kennedy, an austere and distant professional, who happens to be in the audience today because she's my mum, articulates in one of her writings that particular kind of loneliness that happens to be in the ordinary. This is what she writes. Banal normality is what happens to us most of the time. I'm worried about tumors and hormone imbalance, and what is missing in an appointment at the optometrist. I'm plodding towards my destiny of old age, decrepitude, and death in the usual manner. Nothing to read about. Cancel the blog post. Turns out I'm not the center of all things after all. Just a participant in that rough, smooth movement of creation through time. What does your loneliness feel like? Do you feel like the only sad person in a group of happy people? Do you feel like the only happy person in a group of people who have given up? Do you feel like the only one who's actually trying to get anything done around here? Do you feel like the only one who can't get anything done, no matter how hard you try? Is there a grief you're going through that everyone seems to awkwardly tiptoe around? Or worse, a grief everyone expects you to just be over already? Okay, let's leave that to one side for now. Hagar. Now, Hagar's story is a brilliant one, and I won't be able to go into as much detail as I want to in a single sermon, because her story spans several chapters, but we're going to give it a go. Hagar is a slave girl from Egypt in the house of Abraham, and she is the maidservant of Sarah. Presumably they picked her up when they were traveling through there in their younger years. God has promised Abraham a son, but Sarah has been unable to bear one for him, which is the deepest shame a woman can have in this context. And if you remember the sermon on Tamar a few months ago, it puts her in great danger of being left to starve when her husband dies. Eventually, she instructs him to take Hagar as a wife, so that Sarah might bear a son through her. This follows an ancient practice where slaves are used as surrogate mothers. Yes, exactly like The Handmaid's Tale. So Hagar's boss makes her marry her boss's boss. When Hagar found out she was pregnant, Sarah and Hagar begin to have hot conflict. People who tell this story against polygamy tend to present the conflict like, see what happens when you have two wives? They get jealous of each other and catfight. But the situation is more complex than that. Hey, Hagar sees Sarah as literally little in her eyes. The 2,000-year-old Jewish Aramaic translations of this verse drew out the metaphorical meaning. The honor of her mistress was of little value in her sight. Which makes sense, right? First with her marriage, then with her conception. Hagar is becoming less and less Sarah's slave and more Abraham's wife. Sarah's plan to salvage her honor and livelihood has ended up destabilizing her position in the family. So Sarah complains to Abraham, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now she knows she is pregnant. I am little in her eyes. May the Lord judge between you and me." That's a fancy phrase that basically is the verbal equivalent of throwing down the gauntlet. She asks Abraham to rectify the situation, because Abraham is the one who has authority over his wives. But not for long. Abraham essentially relinquishes his authority over Hagar and puts her back under Sarah's power. "Behold, your slave is in your hand. Do to her what is good in your eyes." So Sarah begins to oppress Hagar. This is the same verb that will be used to describe how the Egyptians will oppress the Israelite slaves. In a few generations. But in this case, it is the future mother of Israel oppressing an Egyptian slave. And just like the slaves in Exodus, pregnant Hagar flees. I want to take a moment to examine this dynamic between Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. I think it's a pertinent illustration to something that happens in a lot of power contexts. It's going to be big brain time, okay? So take a moment to stretch and get some blood flowing to your brain. Everyone do some stretches. Got some blood in your brain? Good? Okay. One way to look at this situation is as two conflicts, two power struggles. The struggle between Abraham and Sarah, and the struggle between Sarah and Hagar. This places Sarah in an interesting position. She's dependent on Abraham for her security and livelihood, and in turn, she is in control of the security and livelihood of Hagar, both oppressed and oppressor in a way. Sarah sees Hagar as a threat. "I am the wife and mother," she says. "If Hagar becomes the wife and mother, what role is left for me? She's threatening my space, my place in the system, and I need to protect my spaces from her." But why is Sarah threatened by Hagar in the first place? Who placed Sarah and Hagar in competition for one another? They are fighting for crumbs, but under whose table? Patriarchy has placed these two women in competition with one another, but Sarah, instead of identifying the problem in the people and systems that oppress her, identifies the culprit as the one whom she has the power to oppress. It's like the dynamic between the golden child and the other sibling. The other sibling resents the golden child's success and waits for the downfall, while the golden child works hard to keep being head and shoulders above so that their status isn't threatened. But this whole rivalry isn't the culprit the parents who are playing fairy votes? It's like when I went on a school trip to the Northern Territory, and I saw a bunch of First Nations kids bullying the kid with the palest skin. But the biggest bully, the one leading the charge, was the kid with the second whitest skin. But he chose to show up his status in the group rather than to reach out for those further out from him. It's like when some working class white Australians feel threatened by immigrants. They feel like they're going to steal jobs or houses. But that feeling of scarcity and insecurity isn't caused by immigrants. It's manufactured by economic systems and landlords and Murdoch media. It's like when women in patriarchal churches who fit the role of gentle and mothering feel threatened by women who don't. Or when feminists who advocate for the rights of women in churches feel threatened by queer people who ask for those same rights. Or when queer Christians who choose to be celibate want to distance themselves from those who don't. Or how binary trans people feel like their activist work is threatened by gender non-conforming people. It's like a whole chain of people throwing each other under the bus in an attempt to gain favour in the eyes of those who hold power. Scrabbling for their rung on the ladder. Except that image is too linear. It's more like a web, the messy, intersectional, different ways power is unevenly distributed among humans. But that's too big of a topic for now. So let's take it back to this one question. How would the story have gone differently if Hagar and Sarah had chosen to be allies? Okay, end of that aside. Thank you so much for indulging me. We're going back to Hagar now. So it's like Hagar's run away from her mistreating mistress, walking in the heat of the day, sandals slapping on the desert clay, finds a well and approaches it to take a drink. And God's just like sitting there? And he says, Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? This is the first time anyone refers to her by name. And she says, I am running away from my mistress, Sarah. She doesn't answer the question about where she's going, because she doesn't know. Relatable. God tells her two things. The first one is the tricky one. Go back to your mistress Sarah to be afflicted beneath her hand. Now some of you are hearing that and going, that makes it sound like God is asking me to return to an abusive situation. To which I would say, did God appear to you in person at a well and say this to you? No, well then this word is not for you. In this case, Hagar returning to her mistress means that her son is raised in safety and security for 17 years. And compared to wandering lost in the surrounding desert, it can be hard for us to imagine, but people caught in multiple layers of oppression gladly choose one bad situation to avoid a worse one. But God has words of comfort to sustain Hagar in these circumstances. And boy, are they some words. God gives Hagar prophecy. Promises her the following things. So many descendants, there will be too numerous to count. Hagar is the only woman promised in your Lord's descendants. The same promise the patriarchs of Israel are afforded. He tells her she will bear a son, and he gives her the name he will be called, Ishmael. The list of people named by God before they were born in the Bible is less than 8, and includes Isaac, the promised child, King Solomon, who built the temple, King Josiah, who reformed Israel, John the Baptist, and Jesus. It's a pretty big lineage. The name given to Hagar's son means God hears, because God has heard you. in your affliction. And this son will be a wild donkey of a man. Okay, that sounds silly in English. Stop thinking about Shrek or whatever. The wild donkeys in the Negev region are majestic and stubborn and wild. In Australian, we would call them a brumby, and they are completely untamable. In Job, they had been described as being freed by God. Do you see? God is promising her that her children will be free. Unlike the Israelites in a few generations, Hagar's children will never be made slaves to anyone. What bigger promise could Hagar wish for in that moment? After 17-ish years, God is going to take her out of that situation and give her her own inheritance separate from Abraham's family, her own place in the world. But the story gets crazier. She gave this name to Yahweh, the God who spoke to her, El Roi, the God who sees. For she said, "Even here I have glimpsed the one who sees me." Blessed are the lonely, for God is the one who sees. Now I feel we need to clarify. God is the one who sees is not the same as God is watching you. God is watching you as, well, first of all, that's not really how God ever presents himself. And secondly, it implies that God is peering out from a bush while we try and go on about our day. But it's not like that. It's like intimacy, connection, compassion, recognition, like finding water in the desert and seeing your reflection wobbling back at you from that deep, cool pool. It's like a promise that your children will never be slaves, like the knowledge that someone will hear your voice and someone will tell your story. So Hagar isn't just describing God as someone who sees. The phrase used is very formulaic for naming traditions. When it's written, it's something like, "She named the name of Yahweh, the one who spoke to her, El Roi, God of seeing." God names Adam. Hagar names God. Why does Hagar get to name God in this story? Why does anyone get to name God? God is not named. God is namer. God names Abraham, and declares him father of many nations. God names Simon, Peter, and declares him the rock on which the church is built. Moses, who traditionally authored Genesis to Deuteronomy, including this story, who led the Israelites out of Israel, is in one sense spearheaded the start of Judaism. He doesn't name God. He asks God for his name, and God says, "I am who I am." It's an esoteric name, the kind of infuriating wisdom that never sits still long enough for you to look at. What business has this plain, concrete, eminently comprehensible name of God who sees got doing around the neck of God like a cheap beaded necklace? I'm going to answer that question with another question. In my last sermon with you guys on the book of Joel, I talked briefly about the idea of anointing. Anointing is the practice of setting someone aside for a special task, usually for leadership. New kings and priests in the Bible were anointed with holy oil. Aaron, the first high priest, was anointed by Moses, and Saul, the first king of Israel, was anointed by the prophet Samuel. King Charles III's coronation in May will feature him being anointed with holy oil by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now here's my question. Jesus is called Messiah, or Christ, which literally means anointed one. Who anointed Jesus? While Jesus was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of the people present said indignantly to each other, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. And Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why are you giving her trouble? She has wrought a good work on me. She did what she did. She has anointed my body before my burial." Why does God receive an anointing from an unnamed woman? Why does God receive his name from an Egyptian slave? Why did God become human? Do you remember when King David offered to build God a house? And God said, "No, I will build you a house." God likes to give when you would expect him to receive, and receives from those you would expect him to only give to. I read this in one of my readings this week. According to the self-revelation, God is not an unmoved mover, but the God of Jesus Christ, who goes out of himself and acts in history, who becomes involved in the affairs of his people, and enters into conversation with them. God is closer and more intimate than we allow ourselves to believe. Hagar was alone, politically in her intersections of oppression, socially friendless and in a foreign country, physically walking alone through the desert. God answers all three of these alonenesses. Politically, he promises her freedom. Socially, he meets her as a physical person, calls her by name, and has a conversation with her. And physically, he's sitting at a well. Later in the service, we're going to be reflecting on Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." Traditionally, it was sung by David a few centuries after the story, but I think Hagar could have sung it too, sitting with a new friend in the shadow of a secret well in the Palestinian desert.